Hello and welcome back to the Self-Actualization in the Age of Crisis Chapter Summary Series. I'm your host, Ron Rivers, and today we're going to be discussing Chapter 3, Security and Soldier, subsection Police and the Peacekeeper. So when most people think of the police and what their purpose is, most people kind of assign it the role of a peacekeeper, right? A group of people intending to protect the safety of their community and reduce physical violence within a specific geographic area. But the militarization of our police force and the increasing amount of authoritarian individuals elected into leadership positions has transferred their role from that peacekeeper ideal to law enforcement. And those two things are very different, especially in relation to how those laws are applied within a society and who they are applied to. So there are two primary challenges when we think of reforming police in the United States. One is the individuals themselves who, through interactions with the systems that they're trained into, really kind of begin to embody a really strong feeling of otherness towards those outside of the force. The second is the progressive push to keep it, to have a high degree of independence and freedom from public influence and rule, so acting as their own independent agents. So when we explore law enforcement and kind of reforming it, we have to do it within the context of history and the frameworks of meaning and value implied in the laws that they are enforcing. Right, as a self-actualizer, our entire vision is about embedding new frameworks of meaning and value into the systems we surround ourselves with, whereas police in the immediate present primarily serve to reinforce the status quo. So if laws are unjust, if they systemically oppress one group in favor of another, that's not the police officer's concern. Their concern is the enforcement of those laws. And in many ways, the failure of modern day policing is as much a failure of our educational systems, our economic systems, our social and political systems. All of it is kind of bound in this network that has essentially led us to the crisis. Now, I dive deep into the text about the history of policing. And if you're not already aware, policing in its most literal sense is rooted in slavery. The invention of police forces was to capture slaves who had escaped. Eventually, municipality police forces became prolific through the enforcement of Jim Crow laws. So there's a long history of racism embedded in the institution of policing. And that's why reform is not really an option, because unless you really get to the root of policing and what it is about and why it exists, any amount of small incremental change doesn't change its kind of root purpose. Which is the oppression of the outsiders in favor of insiders. My experience with police officers, which has been pretty plentiful, has taught me without a doubt that their training fetishizes violence, to the point where everyone is seen as a threat who's not part of the police force, and you can never understand the danger they face. Which is a really fascinating concept because, I think in the last 5 years, we've seen ample evidence of how police quell peaceful protests with extreme violence. So, the narratives don't really line up, and I think that's very offensive to some of them, and that's okay. Ultimately, again, it's not about the individual. They're really bound to these systems. Of course, individuals make choices, and we should, rightfully judge and penalize those who are overtly aggressive and breaking the law. But at the same time, they're that angry and fetishize violence because that's what the systems train them to do. Now consider also civil asset forfeiture, where that's where police take assets, take things from people before they've been convicted of a crime or even accused of it. Now evidence suggests that civil asset forfeiture has gone up 600% since 2002, raking in over $35 billion in extra capital for these police forces. Now the problem with civil asset forfeiture is that if you are the subject of this forfeiture and you have not committed a crime, the only way to get it back is through an extensive legal battle. So it costs money to get the things that were stolen from you by the people who are designed to protect you, right? So when we think about just the depth of injustice in this system, it's massive. And let's also consider what gets done with that money, right? When we think about how that money is spent, there's a study I cite in the book that tracks how those monies were spent. You would imagine, better education, better schools, community investment. No, it's, more robust and luxurious facilities, helicopters, military equipment for the police forces, pool rooms and tables and lounge rooms. It's spent on bullshit, to be frank. So the police officers are almost like this reverse Robin Hood in many cases, where they're just taking from people and giving to themselves. Ultimately, civil asset forfeiture is a parasitic practice that deeply harms the communities it is intended to support. So policing as an institution sits in great conflict with the core values that we seek to embody as self-actualizers. And like all of our systems, it's bound to a very specific history. So through the context of revising the system, incremental improvements is not enough. I also want to emphasize that there is a place for all of the participants. Our reimagination of policing and the necessity to do so is not an attempt to diminish or demoralize or destitute those who participate in the systems. There's plenty of opportunities for them within the larger picture of systemic actualization. But again, I emphasize, to align ourselves with a single truth in the relational universe, we cannot have a population of law enforcement that are not bound to the laws that they're supposed to enforce.